What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today I've got some rest of season running back rankings for you guys here for week 16 and 17 for those of you playing that far into the season. But these are the guys that I think are the top contributors in the running back 1s and 2s for the rest of this season. So these guys are the players you need on your teams. Before I get started with today's video, if you guys haven't already, make sure to go down and subscribe to the channel and turn that bell on so you guys are notified whenever I come out with new content. And click the link in the description to head over to my Patreon to make sure all of your guys' questions are answered. So without further ado, let's not waste any more time. Let's hit the intro and get into my top 24 running backs for the rest of this fantasy season. All right, getting started here with my number 24 player, I've got Ezekiel Elliott. And this has just straight up been a season to forget for Zeke. I mean, his numbers have been way down since Dak Prescott was taken out of the lineup due to that injury, and he has just not been the same player this year. The line has been terrible at blocking. The offensive production has been way down. Zeke obviously did not play in Week 15 with an injury to his lower body and is questionable for Week 16 against the Eagles. So there's a chance we don't even see Zeke here. That's why he's a bit lower on my list. And obviously when he's been on the field, though, not the same production we're used to. So Zeke, a guy hopefully who can bounce back next year, and I would start to project things for him for next season as soon as this year is over. But in the meantime, Zeke is a low-end RB2 at best and not a dependable play in lineups here for the rest of 2020. Melvin Gordon comes in at my running back 23 spot here, and Gordon's a guy who we've seen for a number of years now, obviously being a first-round pick by the Chargers all those years ago. He's a very talented player. He's been a guy who's got it done in the running and receiving game for a long time, and the last 3 weeks here, Gordon's been playing some pretty good fantasy football for us. I mean, his production has been pretty decent, had a huge game with 2 touchdowns against the Bills this week. And going forward, I think that he could be a solid RB2 level producer. I mean, the one thing holding him back is the consistency of that Broncos offense, some injuries and off the field stuff. So if Gordon can stay clean here, if he can stay healthy and out of trouble, I think he's going to be a decent guy here down the stretch. Probably not a part of too many championship level teams, because if you're starting him in your lineups on a week-to-week basis, it might not have ended up in the best scenario for you guys, but he's a guy who I think still has some salvageable value here and could be a contributor to championship teams. David Johnson comes in at my running back 22 spot, and Johnson's a guy who was once upon a time one of the top 2 running backs in fantasy football way back in 2016 with Le'Veon Bell. Those two were elite-level producers, but Johnson obviously not in his prime anymore. He's had some issues here with injury this season. A big concussion forced him out for multiple games, and then he was in COVID protocol for a week. But the rushing value since Johnson's return has been down. He only had 10 carries in Week 13 and 8 in Week 15 after return from COVID. But Cincinnati and Tennessee left on the schedule here. I think those are some matchups that Johnson can produce in. And we saw him last week be a very good receiver, so I think that helps his value as well. Le'Veon Bell is my number 21 ranked running back here, and he has been thrust into the starting role in Kansas City. Obviously, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is dealing with a hip strain and an ankle injury, I believe, for the Chiefs. So he will probably not be with us for next week's game. So Le'Veon Bell, in the meantime, will be the starter. Obviously, Kansas City wants to throw the football with Pat Mahomes, get the ball to Kelsey, Tyreek Hill, and those guys and whatnot. But Bell was still decent in Week 15. I think he can produce decent level, low-end RB2 numbers here. He probably, like Clyde Edwards, won't be the most consistent player on a week-to-week basis. But I think that in the meantime, while Clyde is out of the lineup, Bell is a decent level player in fantasy. At number 20, I've got James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Conner's been a guy all season long. He's had decent volume, and he's been highly involved in that offense, but some tough matchups here in the back end of the season in terms of rushing defenses on the other side of the football have really limited his value here, and I think the Steelers have just kind of given up on the run game, to be honest. I mean, Conner's not the most explosive guy. He is that cold-weather power back, the guy that will fit in the holes and push forward for positive yardage, but this guy doesn't have the highest ceiling in the world, and I think he has a bit of a shaky floor. Obviously, though, we see him get those goal line and short and intermediate carries, so he's definitely a guy with some value there, and especially in standard leagues, I really like. But Conner, like I said, the matchups limit his overall production here down the stretch, so I'd be cautious when putting him in lineups. At number 19, Kenyan Drake here is a guy kind of like James Conner. He has a lot of touches in that Cardinals offense, but the matchups and the overall rushing efficiency are really holding him back right now. A measly 4 points against the Eagles in Week 15, and he's got some tough games coming up here. San Francisco in Week 16 and at the Rams in Week 17. Those are terrible games. Two very good defensive fronts and teams that are very good on that side of the ball. So Drake, I would not be too optimistic about starting here down the stretch, just like the rest of these guys on the back end of the list here. I think Drake definitely has a decent potential to have some touchdowns, but outside of that, I think his yardage will be limited, and he will not be a super effective player. Ronald Jones comes in at my running back 18 spot here, and Jones is a guy I really, really like as a player. I think from a talent perspective, if Jones gets the backfield to himself in 2021, this guy can be a top 10 fantasy producer, but he's a middle tier RB2 for me here the rest of this season. Obviously, Leonard Fournette vultures some touchdowns and some carries from him, and production overall. I mean, Jones might not be the best receiver in the world, but as a pure running back, he's so physical and he runs so hard, and I really like his burst in the open field. So I'm hoping Jones gets the workload next season, but right now he's on the COVID protocol, and Fournette is taking those carries, so he's a bit lower for me just because I'm not sure if he's going to be able to play this week or not, depending on how his health is. But Jones in Week 16 is at Detroit. That is a great matchup for all running backs and something I think he can take advantage of and exploit. And then Atlanta in Week 17. So if Jones is on the field, I really like what he can do. Like I said, hoping to project him for a higher upside next season, but Jones, I think, is a guy who still has some value this season. At number 17, I've got Myles Gaskin of the Miami Dolphins. And Gaskin, I think this is a bit of an optimistic ranking for me, but I've got my fingers crossed, and I'm really hoping he can return this week from the COVID list against the Raiders here. I think that's a great matchup, and for a guy being used as a high upside running back too, with workhorse type carries, I love what this guy does on the football field. He is super safe and very consistent. The touch count is there, and we see him get those goal line carries. So in these great matchups, I like what he can do on a yards per touch basis. Week 17, though, he's got a bit of a tougher game against the Bills, but those goal line carries still keep him relevant. And I think if he can punch a couple in, he will be very productive and a lineup savior. So Myles Gaskin, let's hope he can return from the COVID list this week, because I think he can do some big things in fantasy lineups if he's available. At number 16, Cam Akers comes in at my next spot here. And Akers is a guy I'm trying to manage my expectations for here, but I am very optimistic for what he can do in these last two games against some very favorable matchups against the run. So Akers, a very modest game, 15 carries, 63 yards only against the Jets in a Week 15 loss. But I think the encouraging thing here is that the Rams were trailing for the majority of that game, and Akers still received 16 touches total. So I really like that production out of Akers. I think that we might see him have a higher yards per clip here in the next coming weeks against Seattle in Week 16 and Arizona in Week 17. I think he's got a really nice ceiling. And like I said, I think that Rams team, they're probably embarrassed coming back off of this loss from the Jets. I think they're going to come out hungry this next week and bring it to the Seahawks. I think that's a unit they can run the football on. So Akers, I love his value here. Let's be reasonably optimistic here with some caution as well, just because of what we saw last week. But I think we can project some nice games for Akers in these last two games. At number 15, Miles Sanders is another guy I'm cautiously optimistic with here the rest of this season. He was modest in Week 15 in a losing effort against the Cardinals, but in Week 16, he's got the Cowboys, and I think that's a very good matchup for him. I think that after what we saw Jalen Hurts do last week, this offense can be dynamic. They can hand the football off, and they can run it. So I think we just need to see Miles Sanders find the end zone, see some more receiving volume and whatnot. But Week 17, I'd be a bit more cautious against the Washington football team, even though Miles Sanders has had his best games this season and most efficient running when playing some really good fronts. So we'll see about that matchup, but Miles Sanders, a super talented guy, a player I would love to see get the rock more, and someone I think can be a key contributor for some lineups here down the stretch. So Miles Sanders comes in as a mid-tier RB2 for me the rest of this season. At number 14, Jonathan Taylor is a guy I would love to have higher on this list. JT is on a great 4-game stretch right now. I think the one roadblock that's keeping him from being higher on my list is that daunting Week 16 matchup on the road at Pittsburgh to play the Steelers. That unit is very stingy up front. They are very good against the run, and they are fast off the edge. I mean, JT is going to struggle to find space here. He's going to have to get it done in between the guards, right up the middle. I don't think he's going to have success with off-tackle runs, which is not what he's good at to begin with. So he's going to have to be kind of a hammer and a slugger for that Colts offense. They're going to have to play physical football to win this game on the road, and I think that hurts JT's value a bit. And he comes a bit touchdown dependent here. So Jacksonville, though, in Week 17, if he can get through that Week 16 matchup, and you guys have leagues finishing off there in the regular season finale, I love what JT can do, and I think in that game he will have a very high upside. And then Christian McCaffrey comes in at my running back 13 spot, just outside of the RB1 tier for me. He's been falling down my list every week that he's not on the field. And obviously this has nothing to do with his production value when he's on the field, but that's been his biggest issue this season. Only 3 games played this year. He's been elite in each one of those games, but until we see CMC healthy and on the field, he's got to stay down in the rankings for me. Absolutely nothing to do with his play here, but just a guy who availability and dependability have been a big issue for in 2020. At running back 12, I've got Chris Carson of the Seattle Seahawks, and this is a guy I was very conservative with and a guy I was very cautious to put in my top 12, but I ended up deciding to do so just because of the volume and the touchdown production we've seen from him in these last few games here. I mean, he didn't score against the Washington football team. He had a modest 7 points, and the matchups don't get any easier here down the stretch. He's got the Rams front and the 49ers, so definitely not something I'm too excited about there, but the volume and the touchdown production keeps Carson in it for me. He's definitely not a guy I would play as a ceiling play. He's a bit more of a floor play and a guy you're just hoping can find the end zone because I don't think his yardage productions and outputs will be as high as normal in these last couple games here. At running back 11, I've got DeAndre Swift, the rookie for the Detroit Lions, and Swift is a guy who I have heaped praise on this season. He's one of my favorite rookies in the league right now. Super dynamic as a rusher and a receiver. He can get the job done in fantasy and in real life in both facets of the game. And against the Titans, 2 touchdowns. He got back on track after his concussion. I was a little bit concerned about the touches and the total amount of looks he'd get, but 19 total touches in that Week 15 game against Tennessee, and he was very productive. I'm a bit more cautious in Week 16 against Tampa. They are a pretty good unit against the run, but Swift's receiving volume and his ability to make plays after the catch give him some nice value for a mid-end RB2 in that game for me. And then in Week 17 against Minnesota, I think he's back to being RB1. So Swift, I love him the rest of the season. He's even better in PPR leagues, but I think that in this half PPR ranking system that I do, he has to land as a low-end RB1 for me. J.K. Dobbins comes in at my running back 11 spot, and Dobbins, another rookie running back I love to watch play football. This guy is a very, very good talent. I've been watching him since his freshman season at Ohio State, and he's just an explosive runner. This guy breaks away and is gone when he finds open space. I love the way he plays, and he's got 4 straight games with a touchdown for the Ravens. I think he's officially secured that lead back role in Baltimore. Mark Ingram was a healthy scratch against the Jags this week, so Dobbins, I think, gets the looks here down the stretch. He's going to get the volume, although it's not going to quite get to 20 touches because of how many times Lamar pulls the ball and runs himself. I still think he's an elite level producer here, and in some decent games, we'll find the end zone some more. At running back 9, I've got James Robinson, and this is a guy I'm being a bit more conservative with in my rankings here as of late. I think that we have seen the Jags kryptonite here for James Robinson's fantasy value show up a lot more lately than we would have liked. I mean, the Jags are getting blown out and they're not in games. They are not going to be running the football, and so James Robinson is going to take a hit in fantasy. And we saw that in Week 15. I mean, he was knocked out with an ankle injury, but he was bailed out by a touchdown through the air that was caught from Gardner Minshew. So I think that if we don't see Robinson put up a touchdown in some of these tough games when they are getting smoked and throwing the football, he's not going to be the best producer. He's got Chicago and Indy right now, 2 teams who are on fire and playing really good football, and 2 decent fronts as well and good defenses. So I would be a little bit more cautious with James Robinson here down the stretch. Like I said, I would manage your expectations a lot with him here. I think his ceiling is a lot lower than it has been throughout the year. I think his floor might be a bit shaky as well. So we know he's going to get his touches, though. If the Jags can stay in the games, he will be a great RB1 producer. It's just a matter of if the Jags will be competitive or not the rest of the season. Josh Jacobs comes in at my running back 8 spot, and Jacobs is a guy who I think is simply just a volume play and a guy who can find the end zone at a frequent clip. I mean, Jacobs not the most explosive guy in the world, but he did have his first 20-plus yard carry of the season against the Chargers last Thursday night, so that is a good sign for Jacobs' value here and something you definitely look for in fantasy. I was a bit worried about his ankle injury. I thought it would still be lingering, but from what I saw, he looked pretty good and fine, especially on a short week. So I'd be optimistic about Jacobs going forward. Like I said, he's not the most explosive player in the world. He doesn't see the most receptions out of the backfield, but that number has been rising here down the stretch. So I think he's trustworthy for sure. He's definitely a guy that Gruden is going to look to lean on here with potentially missing Derek Carr this week after he pulled his groin in Week 15. So Jacobs is going to be the centerpiece of that Raiders offense. That's what it's been all year. It's not going to change. He's got some really nice fantasy value here down the stretch. I think is definitely a guy you can depend on week 16 through 17. And then at running back 7, I've got Austin Ekeler. And throughout Ekeler's entire career, since we saw him take foot on that Chargers football field, whether it was to fill in for Melvin Gordon during his holdout or to come in and fill in for him during an injury, Ekeler's been highly dynamic. This guy's been very explosive. And in the screen game, outside runs, lining up in the slot, this guy's been a very effective pass catcher. And I think that's what gives him the nudge over the rest of these guys on the list here. Ekeler's been very, very productive. I love him in PPR leagues, and the schedule here down the stretch I think is really advantageous for that Chargers offense as a whole. He's got Denver in week 16. That football team is falling apart. I mean, in garbage time against the Bills last week, Devin Singletary just waltzed into the end zone for a 60-yard touchdown. And he's a very similar body type, a short-statured running back, a quick guy, not the fastest player in the world, but a very shifty and elusive player. And he found the end zone on a big carry. Ekeler, we saw burst outside against the Raiders for a nice 30-yard carry last week. And so I think that matchup is going to be a gold mine for Ekeler owners. And then at Kansas City, week 17, he's got the Chiefs. And I think that Ekeler, he played great against them in week 2. He can have some very nice value again in that game. And I think that going back and looking at the tape, Anthony Lynn, that football team, Justin Herbert, they're going to fix their mistakes. They're going to figure out how to perform better in that game, and Ekeler will be highly involved again. So Ekeler, a mid-tier RB1 the rest of this season. Obviously not the most talented guy in the world in terms of some of the names we see at the top of this list, but he is a very underrated player in his own right and a player who deserves more respect on his name. And then at number 6, I've got Aaron Jones of my Green Bay Packers, and Jones has been slipping down my list a bit as of late, though. Aaron Jones in 2019 was the league leader in touchdowns in the NFL outside of the quarterback position, but that number has been cut in half here in 2020. That's having a big difference on his game here. I mean, when you factor in 20 touchdowns from 2019 and cut that number down to 10 this year, you're losing 60 points of fantasy production. So obviously that makes a huge difference for the guy who finished as running back 2 last year, but Jones is still putting up a nice clip and having a nice amount of volume per game, even though Jamal Williams is being sprinkled in there heavily as well. I mean, Jones had 20 carries, 145 yards, and a touchdown in Week 15 against the Panthers on Saturday Night Football. But I think going forward here against Tennessee, especially in Week 16, Jones is probably going to have a really nice day here. I'd be a bit more cautious in Week 17 against Chicago, but I think for this week, Jones is a top-end RB1 producer. At my running back 5 spot, I had to think long and hard about this one. But David Montgomery, I could not keep him outside the top 5 in this list. He has been absolutely sensational here in this last stretch of games. He's got 4 straight performances of 22.5 or more points in half PPR scoring, and he has 6 touchdowns in his last 4 games. I mean, the level that he has brought that Bears offense to with a below-average offensive line, in my opinion, I think is just exceptional. It speaks to his talent as a player. He is carrying that football team on his back. He's brought them back into the playoff conversation. I mean, David Montgomery has been playing great football lately. He's got the Jags and the Packers here in Week 16 and 17. Those are great matchups, not good teams against the run. I think Montgomery is going to keep going here. Maybe not quite those exceptional of games, but Montgomery is in for a big finish to this fantasy season, and I think is an absolute league winner at this point, and a guy that you can count on in your lineups here these last 2 games. And then at RB4, I've got Alvin Kamara, and this is the lowest spot I've had him at on the list this season, but that doesn't change the fact that I still view this guy as an elite level RB1 producer and a guy who can certainly go out there and get the job done for your teams. I just think that since we've seen Taysom Hill in the lineup, obviously Breeze returned last week, but the ceiling has come down slightly, and I think he's just not quite hitting those top-end marks that we saw from earlier on this year when he was the running back 1 overall, but Kamara is in a rhythm right now. He's got 3 straight games of 15 or more points in half PPR scoring, and he closed the year off here with Minnesota and Carolina. I think he's got some really nice upside as well. And then Michael Thomas being out of the lineup, who knows when he'll return to action here. I think that he is definitely a guy who we might not see until the playoffs because he was placed on the injured reserve. So I think that means more looks for Kamara in the passing game, and this guy is still going to be very productive, especially in PPR leagues. So do not panic on Alvin Kamara. He had probably some modest games in there with Hill, and is starting to get back on track now. So I would keep yourself optimistic for Kamara the last 2 weeks. And then at running back 3, I've got Nick Chubb. And Chubb has turned into the absolute definition of consistency here in fantasy football at a top-end running back 1 producer. I mean, he hasn't scored below 11 fantasy points in half PPR scoring since week 10. The closing schedule here, I think, is decent. He's got the Jets in week 16. I think that's a matchup the Browns can control the pace of, and we know Chubb is going to get his looks. I mean, Nick Chubb's not the flashiest play in the world, but this guy gets the job done each and every single week, and he's honestly looked better coming back from that injury than he did before it. So I think Chubb here going forward, he's probably the purest running back in the NFL and one of the more talented guys at the position. I really like the way he plays. He's explosive in the open field, and he doesn't need a high-end reception count to get the job done and have a nice ceiling. So Nick Chubb, 100% the tier 1 definition of dependability and efficiency here down the stretch. Week 16 and 17, he continues to be a top RB1 for me. And then at my running back 2 spot, I've got Dalvin Cook of the Minnesota Vikings. And Cook exceeded my expectations here as of late. I had him down in my rankings. I had his ceiling lowered a little bit here with some really tough matchups. But against teams like Tampa Bay, he still had a nice 100-yard total. He still found the end zone and was very productive. So Cook has proved, even in a tough game here against New Orleans in Week 16 and finishing off the year at Detroit, which is a very easy matchup. But that Week 16 game in particular, I think he is still going to overcome the matchup. I can't wait to watch the Saints and the Vikings play. It seems like every time these teams play, there are some sparks flying, and these teams do not like each other. So I can't wait to see what Cook does this week. I think he'll be a very productive player and continue to see like 25, 30 touches a game and be a top-end fantasy level player. And then surprise, surprise, Derrick Henry is still my running back 1 here for the rest of the season. And Henry is a guy who only had 1 blip against the Browns, but other than that has 3 of his last 4 games with 23 or more fantasy points. So Henry, the closing schedule is great here at Green Bay and at Houston. Those are 2 very bad run defenses. And being a Packer fan, I know that we struggle to contain running backs, especially of elite caliber like Henry. So a guy right now who's so big, so strong. He is really great in December and January football. Defenders do not want to tackle him. He just punishes guys and runs right through them. This guy gets stronger as the year goes on, and as we get closer to playoff time and Super Bowl contention, Henry is going to be on his A game here and a top-end fantasy player. So regardless of league scoring, Henry is my running back 1 and the guy that fantasy managers need to look out for and hope is not on the other side of their fantasy matchups in Week 16 and 17. Those are my top 24 running backs for the rest of this fantasy football season here in Week 16 and 17. If you guys enjoyed today's video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel and turn that bell on so you guys are notified whenever I come out with a new video or go live for a fantasy Q&A. And make sure you guys go down in the description and check out my Patreon as well. If you want to guarantee that your Week 16 and 17 questions are asked and answered, for sure, go check out the Patreon. I'll be getting back to all of you guys that become members there. So thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for more videos, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.